On a bitter January evening in Chicago, the wind cut through the streets like a blade. Outside a homeless shelter on West Madison Street, an elderly woman sat alone on a cold concrete bench. She wore a worn wool coat, a knitted cap pulled low over her white hair. Both hands folded quietly in her lap. People walked past without a second glance. To everyone hurrying by, heads down against the cold. She was just another old woman on a bench. But she was not who she appeared to be. She was Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, chairwoman of Whitfield Capital Group, one of the most powerful private investment firms in the American Midwest. A woman whose phone calls moved markets. A woman who had never once in 40 years asked anyone for anything. And then, a young man walked over and crouched down in front of her. He held out a paper cup with both hands and said, "It's pretty cold out here. This isn't too sweet, just warm. Please take it." That was all it took. A single cup of coffee, offered with nothing expected in return. Margaret looked down at that outstretched hand. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the corners of her eyes began to grow warm. This is the story of that day. Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, 68 years old. In Chicago's financial district, her name needed no introduction. Founder and chairwoman of Whitfield Capital Group. One of Forbes's most powerful female executives in America. A woman who had carved out her place on Wall Street. With bare hands over nearly 4 decades. Her days began at 4:30 in the morning. While Lake Michigan still lay dark and silent. Beyond the windows of her Lakeshore Drive penthouse. Margaret was already at her desk with the Financial Times spread open before her. 2 hours before her assistant arrived. That early stillness was the only time in her day when she was allowed to simply be a person, not a chairwoman. Not a brand, not a name on a building. People described her in certain ways. Cold, uncompromising. One columnist once wrote that she was the most feared woman in Chicago. And a former business partner said that making eye contact with her in a negotiation felt like being pinned to a wall. Margaret read these things and turned the page. There was no point in arguing with the truth. But she had a daughter. Claire, 32 years old. After her husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, Margaret had raised Claire entirely on her own. She had been so consumed by keeping the company afloat, by convincing the board, by fighting battles that never ended, that one day she looked up and Claire was already a grown woman. That realization settled somewhere cold in her chest. But she had long ago learned not to linger there. And now Claire had brought home a man. Ethan Collins, 29 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. Both parents gone early. Raised by his maternal grandmother. Graduated from a state university on a full scholarship. Currently working as a community manager at a small nonprofit on Chicago's South Side. His annual salary was less than Margaret spent on her corporate card in a single month. She closed the background report and looked out at the lake for a long moment. So this is the man my daughter wants to be with. The thought became discomfort, and discomfort became suspicion. Her old friend Patricia had raised the same concern over lunch. That a young man with no family name and no connections doesn't fall for a billionaire's daughter out of pure feeling alone. Margaret set down her fork and said nothing. That evening, back in her office, she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out an old photograph. Robert and a young Claire, smiling wide in the afternoon sun. She studied Claire's face for a long moment. When was the last time she had seen her daughter smile like that? She put the photograph away and rose from her chair. If you want to truly know a person, you watch them when they have nothing to gain. That had been Margaret's method for 40 years. Not contracts, not resumes, not handshakes the moment someone's guard is completely down. That is when you see who they really are. The next morning, she told her assistant to clear her schedule. No explanation. Then she went to her closet and pulled out an old wool coat, a faded scarf, a pair of boots with worn-down heels. She stood in front of the mirror for a moment. 68 years old, lines in her face, white hair. Without the suit, she was just an ordinary old woman. She exhaled quietly and opened the front door. The cold hit her the moment she stepped out of the cab on West Madison Street. She pulled her scarf tighter and walked slowly. The old boots felt nothing like her heels, but she gave no sign of it. There were already a few people on the bench in front of the shelter. An older man wrapped in a blanket. A middle-aged woman gripping a coffee cup. A young woman staring at nothing in particular. Margaret settled into the far end of the bench without a word. The moment she sat down, the cold of the concrete pushed up through her coat. Time passed. A battered van pulled up to the curb. On its side, in hand-painted letters, were the words South Side Community Outreach. The doors opened and a handful of young volunteers stepped out, carrying insulated bags and stacks of paper cups. One of them caught Margaret's eye. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark brown hair, a jacket that was old but clean. He took one look around as soon as he arrived, and then simply began moving without anyone telling him to, without anyone watching. The way someone moves when a place already feels familiar to them. And then his eyes found Margaret, sitting alone at the end of the bench. He paused for just a moment, then walked over and crouched down to meet her at eye level. That small gesture, lowering himself, landed somewhere unexpected inside Margaret. People had always stood before her, coming to report, to sign, to ask. No one had ever made themselves this small. He poured coffee into a paper cup. "Not too sweet," he said. "Just warm." Margaret slowly reached out and took it. The warmth spread across her palms the instant she wrapped her hands around it. She said nothing, not because she couldn't find words, but because she wanted to hold that warmth a little longer before doing anything else with it. When he moved to leave, she said thank you, quietly, barely above a murmur. He smiled openly, without performance, and went to check on the others. Margaret watched his back as she brought the cup to her lips. The coffee was bitter on her tongue. And then, following close behind the bitterness, came the warmth. For a moment, she forgot that she had come here to test him. Margaret steadied herself. She was not a woman who came undone over a cup of coffee. In 40 years, she had met countless people who led with warmth. But whether that warmth was genuine only became clear later when the other person had nothing left to gain. About 30 minutes later, Ethan came back around. While the other volunteers were packing up, he was quietly doing one more pass. He noticed she was still there, and asked softly if she might want to go inside where it was warmer. Margaret answered that she was fine. And then, deliberately, she sharpened her tone. She told him a young man like him had no business wasting time here. That he should be out finding a real job. As she said it, she watched his face carefully. For irritation. For that overdone pleasantness people perform when managing someone difficult. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He looked down at the concrete between his feet. Then he sat down quietly beside her and, after a pause, began to speak. His grandmother had passed away a few years ago, he said. She had been living alone. He hadn't been there with her when it happened. His voice came down softly at the end of the sentence. He said that at first, coming here was about her. But now he thought he simply came because he wanted to. He added that last part gently, without asking for anything in return. Margaret did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward on the people passing by, on the bare branches of a tree bending in the wind. But none of it registered. Something was moving slowly up through her chest and into her throat. She refused to name it, but it had already reached the outer corners of her eyes. She turned her head to the side. Slowly, as though she simply felt like looking elsewhere. Today, Margaret Whitfield had come to conduct a test. Somewhere along the way, she had become the one being tested. 3 days later, Margaret was at her desk, when her assistant knocked and opened the door just slightly. Claire had called, she said. It seemed like Ethan might have figured something out. Margaret's hand stopped, still holding her pen, hovering over the page. She looked up slowly. He knows. Those 2 words moved through her chest quietly. And strangely, she wasn't afraid. The fact that she wasn't afraid was what unsettled her. Ethan now knew. The old woman on the bench had been Claire's mother. The cup of coffee he had handed over without a second thought had gone to one of the most powerful women in the country. So what would he do now? Would he come to her differently, more careful, more eager? Would he pull away? Would he be hurt? Margaret looked out at the Chicago sky. A sheet of gray cloud hung low over Lake Michigan, moving slowly toward the shore. The answer would come in part 2. That is where we leave things today. What will Ethan do now that he knows the truth? And what will Margaret feel when she finds out? The story continues in part 2. If you'd like to stay with us for the rest of Margaret's journey, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening.